virtual machines. Another option that they provide is Docker.
Right.
And in that case, an image is pulled down for a container, and that container is launched, and you do your development inside that container. And just like we do with our current libvirt-based boxes, you can mount a volume into the container and have your source code be present inside the container. And I think it would be relatively simple for us to get this working and have the exact same thing happen where we pull down a Fedora container image and run the installer inside the container using the source code that's been mounted into it and provide a working environment.
By running,
what do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I'm looking at it. It looks like we'd run Pulp install against it, and the container would actually be it's probably running systemd inside the container, and it's actually very similar to how our Ansible molecule is a testing framework for Ansible. It's what our Pulp installer CI actually uses.
And so the reason concept. I'm interested in this is because I think it would provide more opportunities for people to contribute. I think Docker is. Earlier we talked about possibly providing boxes that are VirtualBox based, and I think we could do that with contributions to Forklift, because all of our stuff is really based on boxes that are provided in Forklift, and we just make derivative versions of them. And I think the same thing probably we would want to do here is with the ability to do this for Docker, we would probably contribute something to Forklift.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking of using Docker as a way of speeding up the overall process of using vagrants. That's not slowing down your system as much, and it provisions faster.
Yep.
That was my thought. If it attracts more users, I wasn't thinking of that. Like I don't think.
Well,
I don't think it'll,
not necessarily users, but the contributors.
Yeah,
really,
contributors. Yeah.
So, Mike, you said this would be less resource usage on the hosting machine than spinning up a whole VM. Did I understand that correctly?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, I also agree. And also with the point about decreasing the provisioning time, I think that's a thing. By the way, Haas's development environment is Docker-based, container-based.
Yeah. I mean, the other option is to use pre-built images too to speed things up even more if we could, but right now we're just talking about running Pulp install against it, which still would go a little bit faster. I think the biggest improvement would be just because it's a container, it's sharing the RAM with the host OS. You don't have to worry about your host dropping or guests having free RAM or vice versa.
Right. When we say Docker here, do we mean actual Docker or do we really mean container?
I think we mean container.
Okay. If we're okay with that, I'm going to change that to container, because Docker these days means specifically you're tied to docker.com.
Yeah.
Actually, I do not mean that. I'm looking at the docs right now on Vagrant's website, and they only reference Docker specifically.
Yeah, so I got to look that up because I think it is...
If speaking in terms of Vagrant,
there is a Vagrant. There is a Podman provisioner.
Oh, okay.
It's a provider, not a provisioner, though. A provisioner is like Ansible that runs against the virtual environment, and then the provider is the virtual environment.
This is what I'm looking at here. I'm going to put it into chat.
And that's just to be clear, that's not a showstopper for me. I would kind of prefer it not to be Docker required, but I'm okay with using stuff that's Docker required. It's just kind of suboptimal, as given some of our and a lot of people's experiences with Docker, the company.
Yeah, right. I understand. Believe me, I don't like the limitation either. It's just all they support for a provider. So like if we were to use the Podman provisioner, it would install a libvirt VM or Docker container and then run Podman on top of it.
Yeah, when we have anytime that we have multiple objectives, like using forward-thinking technologies that are easy, like Podman, or growing the Pulp contributor community by making that easy, and they negatively affect each other, I think we have to pick one that's more important. And I think that growing the contributor base is more important than picking particular technologies. Not that anyone's necessarily saying that, but so with that in mind, like our mileage may vary in terms of using Podman, but if the rubber hits the road and it doesn't work out, then we'll use whatever we need to, I think.
Yep. So do we want to move forward with this and see if forklift maintainers want to add a Docker-based box? Because I think that would be the best, simplest thing to do is to add another box that has Docker listed as the provider.
I think they even do this. Maybe
I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, but because it's a different provider. It's not just a different box. They'd have to go into their provider Ruby code and all.
I'll let me pull up their docs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right, I'm not seeing it in their docs. And yet our development environment for a while had Docker support, and I think still does.
Well, the way you specify Docker support is you say -- provider and say that you want the box to use that provider and not the one that's your default one. Because on our boxes, the default provider is libvirt.
I see.
On our laptops.
Yeah, that might be in like the not the box per se, but other parts of our repo, but still.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm worried about the additional maintenance overhead, and it still wouldn't help us with SE Linux or FIPS unless your laptop has SE Linux and FIPS going, I guess, which probably does.
Yeah, I don't think we can see it as a replacement. I think we can only see it as an addition.
Yeah.
And that, I think, double underscores your point about additional burden.
And I don't think it'll help us attract Windows or Mac users either. Like, they basically need VirtualBox.
I agree.
There's Docker for Windows, though, that might actually work now. I mean, with the new WSL2, but...
Does Fedora not publish VirtualBox images? Is that the challenge?
Fedora publishes VirtualBox images, no up to date. It's just like we have to create custom images for like CentOS 8 FIPS, you know?
Yeah, CentOS doesn't.
So, yeah, like the images are just out of date, and they don't do FIPS ones, so we create them. We could do that for VirtualBox, though. I could create those images. It's not hard. It just requires me to have a separate personal machine whatever with VirtualBox.
When we talk about attracting new contributors, we probably don't need every box to be runnable in those scenarios.
Right.
That's fair.
One Fedora, one Debian box should be enough.
Yep, we're discussing this. We want to have a recommended box, like Fedora 32 or Debian. I mean, it sounds like there's like moderate desire for this, but no huge desire. It doesn't look like anybody's so critically low on RAM right now or anything.
Well, I mean, my desktop here has a ton of RAM and CPU, so it doesn't affect me directly, but I know that we have had community folk in various channels grumbling about having to spin up a whole VM to do development.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
that's my big concern, and I think to second what Brian said, if we can provide this support as a way of saying to the community, we hear you, and maybe this will make your lives a little faster and a little easier and a little less resource intensive. I think it's a good idea.
Yeah.
I believe we do crazy stuff to make it work in Molecule.
We do have to do some weird stuff in Molecule, like with the container permissions and all.
Well, I agree to use Docker because the Mac, that helps me a lot. But to say through the Molecule use on the Mac, that's terrible experience.
So, Pavel, are you using the Docker backend on the Mac?
No, I got the virtual box right now. I got Docker installed. I try something with it. So I believe it can go smoothly. So
cool, but you are using VirtualBox.
Yeah,
that's good.
Now
that's really good to hear.
Yeah, it was easier. I can play more with it, like for my needs.
I've heard from the Galaxy NG developers, that they also use the VirtualBox on Mac. And Dennis, maybe I missed it, but maybe you can unpack restate your kind of interest in the matter.
Well, my interest is to allow developers to spin up an environment that doesn't require as many resources, or perhaps they don't have any sort of virtualization stuff installed.
Right. Let me share my outside Europe and US point of view. Rent is a thing very expensive, and for Brazilians, it is definitely a problem.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right.
So
I think we should.
That's less resource intensive would help.
Right. I think it's clear that like the benefits of this are large enough, and the maintenance will be worth it. Maintenance less communication, It's just a question of how long does it take to implement. We don't know how long it'll take to implement. It'd just be like adding some config lines here and there, and maybe rewriting a bunch of Ruby scripts in Forklift and Pulplift, because they basically write Ruby scripts like template all the Vagrant files. Yep. I'd say it's worth pursuing, though.
Yeah, what I'm not hearing anybody say no. This is a bad idea, or I'm not even hearing anybody say, whatever. I think what I'm hearing is everybody thinks this is worth looking into. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I really like this idea. However, I would like to insert my 2 cents. Going back to Fabrizio's presentation, it feels like we have a lot of room for improvement in our current installers and figuring out and telling the users what's the best use case to use Vagrant, Pulplift, and all the stuff. So I was wondering, maybe we should first focus on this before going into adding one more option. What do you guys think?
That's a good point.
Yeah, it's a really good point. The merge Pulplift into Pulp installer feels like it should happen first.
Sure.
To me, he says with a noticeable lack of confidence.
Yeah, I mean that all makes sense, and we definitely have limited resources, so we should prioritize things accordingly.
Yeah, and that's pretty much where I'm at with it. It's a good idea. It's a fine idea. It's a time and priorities problem, and I just don't know when that time is right.
Yep.
Can we maybe step some issues or stories for the sake of tracking, so all this conversation just doesn't get forgotten? Or you guys think it's a unnecessary step?
No, I think writing up a task and putting into Redmine would be good. And we'll get to it when we get to it, I guess.
Yeah.
But it won't take much effort to write up a task with the motivation and what we want to get out of it.
One more question from a using perspective. How much would it change the workflow in a dev environment?
I think it would be the same because you would have a Fedora container or a CentOS container, and you would still use the systemd service files to control all the services. And so all the aliases that we have would work for you.
Also, I believe that architecturally we would still be keeping our checkouts on the host machine.
That's right.
So that's an important, that's kind of a big deal in terms of how people prefer to develop.
Right. It also,
like using your own editor.
Yeah, all that, and that would all be. I perceive that to all be the same with this type of a support option.
So what I'm hearing is that this could, if this were in place and I created my dev box using this approach as opposed to the current VM approach, after that everything's the same. I'm going to get a command line inside the container, if you will, and then just run things like I do right now on my and I don't know if we would SSH into the container or if we would use the Docker client to connect to the container. Sure.
It'd be whatever the vagrant command wraps around.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's why I started to say SSH and then I realized, no, that might actually be something that had to change, but still, I would be.
I'm not sure about.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, one thing that will happen is that there will be a performance drop just in general with IO related operations because you're now passing through. I mean, I assume all of you are developing on RHEL. So then that means that you're going to be dealing with everything that's horrible with overlay FS. And with your IO heavy based program, that's just going to suffer like a lot. It will be bad. And so that might actually throw your perceptions about how everything works out of whack as well. So that's a thing to consider when you're talking about like, well, we want to do this Dockerized development process. Well, like you're gonna introduce a lot of lag and latency into your IO path, which is actually like the most painful part of Pulp as it is today. And so that's something to be concerned about.
Yeah, we're on Fedora, but it still uses overlay FS though.
Well, I mean, if you change it, the Fedora Docker, Podman, or whatever you're going to use, right? You can change the driver if your underlying file system supports a different one. Like if you're using Btrfs, you can use the Btrfs driver, and all of these I/O problems go away. But if you're doing this on RHEL, your only choice is device mapper, which every layer actually like impedes performance and has other penalties across the board, or you use overlay FS, which has quirky, odd I/O behaviors and can cause all kinds of other problems with things like doing renames or moves and like there's just it is not POSIXly, and if you depend on POSIXly behavior, like overlay FS is going to make your application choke.
Right. Yeah. Another like issue I want to point out because it bit me very badly like a week ago is just like every once in a while you run into some horrible bug when running like stuff on a container or systemd on a systemd container on a systemd host. That's what bit me recently. Like I cannot restart services in Ansible molecule containers, which are very, very similar because of a recent bug in systemd. And that makes the installer fail when it tries to restart a service. I could dig up the bug, but so occasionally there will be some like environment bleeding from the host to the guest.
So it sounds like there's some technical hurdles we have to at least understand, right? Like the performance one, maybe we can't fix that, But at a minimum, we have to be able to say, here's 2 ways to do your dev environment. If you do this one, some things are easier, but your performance is going to be N% worse in these, categories. Kind of setting expectation stuff. But
Right.
I haven't yet heard this is a complete showstopper. Also haven't heard this is job one. So I think it's a great idea. And I like the idea of let's get some issues open so we can kind of, people have a place to throw in their ideas and then pick this up as other stuff falls off of our have to happen now list. How does that sound?
I agree.
Yep. And I wrote for myself an action item to write up a task for creating this
cool
Docker-based box.
And I noticed that Robin was nodding her head, so I'm not going to get fired for having said that. So,
just for maybe a little bit of context, we where I work, we use a similar methodology. It's not Docker-based; it's LexC-based. But all of our development works on our local machine, and then we use LexC containers to spin up and test what we're doing. And it works very well. From an I/O perspective, I'm pointing it to LVM thin volumes. It's not going to be the same as raw hardware, but it's not as slow as writing to a local file system either. And it's certainly exceedingly convenient and speeds up our development internally.
Yeah, and to be clear, like the way I tend to do this kind of stuff is I tend to use systemd nspawn, and because I've got Btrfs on my system, like nspawn automatically creates snapshots and layers and manages all those things for you for the volumes. And LexC can do the same thing. If you're using LVM or Btrfs, it will do this automatically for you. And then once you have because LexC and nspawn actually are essentially operating system virtualization style containers rather than Docker and Podman being application initializing containers. I don't have a better phrasing for that, but whatever. You can actually manage systemd units properly. Like, so that means that you can replicate that workflow. You can actually test that really cheaply. And it becomes really, really straightforward. Scale up and down the workflow in terms of like, how is this supposed to be set up? How are people supposed to experience it? And you're not deviating in any sort of meaningful way from how satellite systems will set it up, or a person will set it up individually on a box or whatever. Like, so from that perspective, nspawn and LexC are way nicer options for doing that sort of thing. At least from my opinion.
Yeah. That was one of the main reasons why we went with LexC, was the fact that you could effectively mimic a container, a host, without having to the weight of KVM or VMware. So it's kind of in the middle, and we do all of our systems development for all of the hardware that we're running. And there's only 1 or 2 areas that we can't work with, like hardware.
To also note, just in case people aren't aware of this, you can use nspawn to boot a VM too. So you can start as a container, and if you need to test a workload with like a different kernel with the same runtime environment, like you can do that. It is systemd machines allows you to do virtual machines using the same roots that are used for nspawn containers. And so you can stack up the isolation characteristics as you need to. So that can come in handy.
How do you spell nspawn?
Quick thing, we're out of time, by the way. Just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, I think we do have 1 or 2 other topics to cover.
Do we have an empty slot tomorrow?
Oh, we don't.
Will closing ceremony take 50 minutes?
I mean,
I'm going to be drinking beer.
So
yeah, I mean, we can definitely continue. I'm supposed to host that one. We're mainly going to listen to the Rebecca Black Friday song. So we could probably spare a little bit of time if we must.
feel that's a fine
Oh.
trade-off.
Is it
I
though?
really want to talk about caching at least just for a few minutes. Not today necessarily, although we could, but
Okay,
maybe
great.
tomorrow.
All right, great. So why don't we plan to continue this tomorrow? I'm looking down here. I hear a call for a caching conversation. Daniel, I agree completely. Is there another topic? I just want to get the topics agreed on.
Ubuntu support in the installer is the other one.
Okay, Ubuntu support in the installer.
Yeah.
Okay, and we will manage our time to cover both of those. We'll be a little bit more time focused tomorrow. Both of those topics and the Rebecca Black report and parts tomorrow.
One thing I wanted to mention to remind people, today is Docs Day, so please don't forget that.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good
I'm going to
point.
be working on publishing the docs, though.
That's fine.
That still counts. That totally counts.
Absolutely counts.
Yeah, we have also for 370 we have these 2 docs issues, or maybe 1 docs issue.
Actually, since Neil and Douglas probably have no idea what we're talking about, we noticed a few sprints back that documentation issues tend to be like, oh yeah, we need to do that, and then they get stuck behind a lot of other things. And so we're trying every release, at least, to have a day where we don't fix anything except documentation bugs. So that's what we're talking about.
Cool. And other reminder, there is a retro doc, so encourage folks to put some info on there, any feedback, things that we should definitely do again next year, don't ever do again, all that. So I dropped a link in there, and you can find it on the schedule as well.
Cool. Thanks, Robin.
All right.
All right, I'm going to end the broadcast now.